So there's a whole lot of YouTube channels that'll make a big point of saying, first of all, we try to fact check everything, and second of all, if we get something wrong, let us know and we will either do a pinned comment correction or a video correction. And I have no interest in making those claims or doing either of those things because I don't think it's worth my time. And if you follow my channel for a while, you'd have some idea why, most likely, which is that I think frameworks matter a lot more than facts. And so, to my mind, I'm trying to get facts correct. Like, if it's easy for me to check, I will. But a lot of facts are open to interpretation. If I'm getting something slightly wrong, it may not affect my main point. And a lot of the time, if I'm using an example that I'm actually wrong about, if it's an example of a broader phenomenon, getting one example wrong still doesn't necessarily undermine the framework. And so the only time that I would make a video saying, hey, I got a fact wrong, is if it's basically a load-bearing fact that the video couldn't survive without. And it's clearly the case to me that, yeah, I was factually wrong here. On the other hand, because of the importance I place on frameworks, it matters to me if I am getting a framework, a conceptual sort of way of looking at the world, incorrect, even if it is not a load-bearing argument of the video. And so a while ago, I had a commentator who, yes, I recognize you, because he leaves a bunch of comments basically calling me an idiot, and then several saying, debate me, bro, about why social engineering works. And I'll make videos on social engineering. I'm not going to argue with a random commentator, especially when he's presupposing a whole bunch of stuff. But occasionally he leaves helpful comments. And one that surprised me is he told me that I got Michael Polanyi's conception of the fiduciary principle wrong in this book. And so the way that he was describing it, I was looking at that and I'm wondering, the way he was describing it, it sounded like maybe he was conflating it with Michael Polanyi's idea of the importance of a living tradition. But I also couldn't dismiss it. I'm like, I need to actually look this up. And if the index of this book was more detailed, I could have just checked this book, find the stuff I read and what it said. But this book doesn't even have fiduciary in the index. But it was still nagging at me, did I get this concept wrong? So I looked into the secondary literature first. And I didn't really find a lot, but some of the papers, especially this one, which not really showing up, well, the post-critical symbol and the post-critical elements of Polanyi's thought by Phil Mullins, and I'll link that, mentioned that a lot of the references to, basically there were two fiduciary ideas. One of them is the fiduciary commitment, and one of them is the fiduciary program. And so, for one thing, the fiduciary principle, that's basically me confabulating something that was not a term that he seems to have used. But he apparently developed the idea of the fiduciary program a lot in this book, which I haven't read, but the index is better. So I was able to actually go and check where he talks about fiduciary commitments and where he talks about the fiduciary program. And so now I want to talk about what my representation of what the fiduciary principle was, what the commentator said it was, and what my understanding of a fiduciary commitment and the fiduciary program are, which are actually two different ideas in Polanyi's work, although with the program I'll mention, I'm only reading the introduction, and until I read more in detail, I won't be able to actually get more than a general idea. And so the way that I presented it in the video, what I thought the fiduciary principle was basically an early idea of Nassim Nicholas Taleb's idea of skin in the game, of you shouldn't trust people who don't actually have some cost to what they believe. And that turns out to not be quite correct with fiduciary commitment, at least as it's represented in this book. But the commenter was, if I'm remembering correctly, he was saying that the fiduciary principle was about the idea of committing to apprenticing from professional scientists, which is why, as I said, I thought maybe he was confusing it with Polanyi's idea that science is a living tradition and you need to learn from scientists. And certainly one thing that I think it is, this paper that I mentions, is that Polanyi does argue that you need to have an understanding of how a scientific field works internally before you can figure out useful ways to revolutionize it, change the script. And I don't think it's necessarily true. I think a lot of the most important scientific revolutions have come from outsiders, but I do think you need to have some grounding in some part of the scientific tradition to really have that kind of impact. And so Polanyi's idea of the fiduciary commitment is basically that all frameworks, all paradigms, all sort of scientific traditions require accepting certain assumptions, taking them on faith. And that when you try to use those assumptions to examine the very basis of what you believe, you're going to get incoherence. And that is, I guess, where post-critical comes from, is because he was criticizing a lot of this sort of critical analysis, critical theory approach to scientists that was starting to arise at the time. And so basically you need to start from a point of faith in the system you're using in order to criticize it. And I'm realizing that is kind of, like, as I said, I'm going to make a video on crank magnetism, and I've realized, like, I've adopted a lot more and more views that would be seen as fringe or crank, right? But it's still coming from generally assuming that the established knowledge, the established experts are basically right, unless I have a good reason to think they're not, and I've just been finding more and more reasons for it. Whereas if I were to just abandon this idea of empiricism entirely and just say I'm going based on my gut first reaction feelings, I would not get anywhere. And so that's my new understanding of the fiduciary commitment, is that you are committing to a given framework and sticking to it, even when you can't prove it and even when there is a cost to sticking to it. And then the fiduciary program, actually, so the fiduciary program is part of what I was saying is the fiduciary commitment. So the fiduciary commitment is simply trying to stick to a basic worldview and the assumption of that worldview, even when there's a cost to it. And the fiduciary program is recognizing that fundamentally you need certain assumptions, and you can't justify any program based entirely on itself, if that makes sense. At least that's my understanding, just reading a few pages. And as I said, I really need to read a lot more Polanyi before I'm confident on the fiduciary program, especially because reading the secondary literature, it's clear that it was complicated and involved. But what I was referring to as the fiduciary principle is the fiduciary commitment. And so in that sense, the commentator who was correcting me was sort of fundamentally correct in that you're still accepting certain principles of the tradition you're operating in, even if it's not submitting yourself to an apprenticeship. And maybe I'm misremembering that. And I was also a little bit correct in thinking that it was about having a cost to yourself, but not as a predecessor to Taleb's idea of skin in the game. And so I think this is interesting because I've criticized people for getting frameworks like completely backwards, and I don't think I did that here. But I think the reason that happens is because we tend to try to link things to what we already know. And I think there is often benefit in getting other people's frameworks slightly wrong because that mutates and evolves and gives you new things to test. But it also, if it's something that's useful to a lot of people and you're getting it wrong, you are less likely to get it more right in a useful way. Although overall, we move forward by having some people get stuff wrong in a useful way. But the other thing is that in this case, Polanyi's idea of the fiduciary commitment is actually very different from skin in the game, even if there's a little bit of overlap. And so by thinking it was basically a predecessor to Taleb, I missed the actual useful part in there. And so even though I don't think it really undermined any of my essential arguments, because I was basically saying Polanyi anticipated Taleb and this is Taleb, I still wanted to talk about that because it sort of fits in, again, as I said, it's not that I think facts don't matter, and I try to get facts correct as well as I can. I just don't think that the amount of obsession we have with trying to factually verify stuff is healthy. I think we should try to make a good faith effort to use facts we believe are true and try to verify them. But again, there's things that are questions of interpretation, things that are half wrong but don't undermine your argument, things that are used as an example, and even if you're completely wrong in that example, the underlying point could still be correct. And so I'm not willing to take the energy to try to obsessively get all my facts right, but I do want to try to get the frameworks I'm talking about right, because that is important. And I have gotten way worse about reading the comments for a number of reasons. So if you see me seemingly get a framework wrong, please feel free to email me and tell me what you think I got wrong. I can't guarantee I'll respond, but if it looks like it's a plausible case where I got it wrong, I will try to actually look into it and check that, because that is sort of what this channel is to a large degree about. And I want to get my representations of these frameworks that I'm talking about largely correct and not get things wrong there. And that is something where, as I said, even if it's not load-bearing to my argument, I still want to correct it. So anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one.